The grand wedding hall shimmered under the glow of golden chandeliers, their light dancing off the intricately designed silk drapes. The air was thick with the scent of fresh roses, and a soft melody played in the background as elegantly dressed guests filled the space. Laughter and hushed conversations echoed through the hall as men in tailored suits and women in sparkling gowns exchanged pleasantries. It was a wedding fit for royalty, an event meticulously planned down to the last detail. Yet, despite the opulence surrounding him, David stood at the entrance unnoticed, his hands gripping the edges of his cheap, wrinkled suit. His heart pounded against his chest as he took a deep breath, scanning the room. He had expected whispers, stares, maybe even outright mockery, and he was not wrong. The moment his presence registered among the guests, a ripple of unease spread across the hall. Eyebrows raised, lips curled into smirks, and hushed voices carried a quiet judgment. "Is he a server?" one woman murmured to her friend, her gaze flickering over his ill-fitted jacket and faded shoes. "Maybe a distant cousin. Surely he is not from the groom's side," a man in an expensive three-piece suit remarked with a chuckle, swirling the champagne in his glass. David swallowed hard but did not react. He knew this would happen. He had planned for it. Today was not just a wedding day for him, it was a test. For weeks he had heard of the expectations placed upon him. He was the heir to a successful business empire, a man of wealth and power. Everyone assumed his wedding would be nothing short of a spectacle, an affair filled with extravagance. But David had always been skeptical of the world around him, wary of those drawn to his fortune rather than to his heart. And so he decided to do something no one expected. Instead of the designer tuxedo he had ordered, he arrived in a simple, outdated suit, one that told no tales of riches, no stories of luxury. He wanted to see for himself whether the woman waiting for him at the altar, the woman who had sworn to love him, would see beyond the fabric, his bride Sophia. His breath hitched as his eyes finally found her. She stood at the far end of the hall, radiant in a white gown, a vision of elegance and grace. Her veil cascaded down her back, her hands delicately folded in front of her. But it was her eyes that held him still, the eyes he had fallen for, the ones that once looked at him with nothing but warmth. Would they still shine with love when they landed on him now? As he stepped forward, the murmurs grew. He caught sight of Sophia's mother, a woman who had always spoken highly of him, now watching him with barely concealed disgust. Her father, standing proudly beside her, wore a look of disappointment. It was clear he had already been judged. With every step, his confidence wavered. What if this was a mistake? What if this test would break something that could never be repaired? And then finally Sophia turned. For a moment the world seemed to pause. The music faded, the whispers dulled. David felt his pulse quicken. His fingers twitched at his sides. He braced himself for the worst. And then she spoke. What she said next shocked everyone in the room. For a moment David's heart seemed to stop. He had prepared himself for anger, for disappointment, perhaps even for outright rejection. But what he had not expected was the way Sophia's eyes softened the instant she saw him, her lips parted, her gaze lingering on his suit. But instead of shock or embarrassment, something else flickered across her face, a quiet understanding. And then she spoke. "David." Her voice was steady but filled with something no one in the room could quite place. A hushed silence spread among the guests. All eyes were on her, waiting for her reaction, waiting for judgment. David felt a lump rise in his throat. His entire life had been shaped by expectations, by image, by wealth. He had never been truly seen as just a man. Would Sophia prove to be like the rest? But before he could brace for her next words, he was pulled back into memories of why he had chosen to do this in the first place. David had never been poor, not even close. He was raised in a world of endless comforts, where his every wish was granted before he could even voice it. His father, a self-made billionaire, believed in power, control, and wealth above all else. He taught David that love was conditional, a transaction, something given in exchange for status, for security. His mother, on the other hand, had been different. She had once lived a simple life. He still remembered how she would sit beside him at night, her fingers gently brushing through his hair, whispering stories of a world where love was not measured in bank accounts. "David," she would say, "the hardest thing in this world is knowing who truly loves you." As a child, he never understood why her voice held sadness when she said that. But as he grew older, he did. At school, friendships came easily, too easily. Boys wanted to be close to him because of his name. Girls were drawn to the lifestyle he could offer. No one seemed interested in David, the person. It was always David, the heir. By the time he was a teenager, he had already built a habit of questioning everyone's intentions. Did they really care? Or were they just waiting for what they could gain? It was a lonely way to live. Then came Sophia. She had entered his life quietly, without pretense or expectation. They had met at a charity event of all places, a gala where rich men wrote checks and walked away feeling noble. But she had not been like the others. Instead of socializing with the elites, she had been in the back, speaking with the children. The charity was meant to help. David had watched her from across the room that night. She had laughed with those kids, knelt to their level, listened to their stories with genuine interest, and when he approached her, expecting the usual questions about his father's business or his family's wealth, she had surprised him. "You look uncomfortable here," she had said, tilting her head as she studied him. He had chuckled, caught off guard. "What makes you say that?" She shrugged. "I do not know. You just look like you would rather be anywhere else." No one had ever noticed that about him before. From that moment on, something between them shifted. David found himself drawn to her, not because she was impressed by his name, but because she never once treated him differently because of it. She was warm, kind, and fiercely independent. She never asked about his wealth, never showed any interest in his luxurious life. It terrified him, because for the first time in his life he thought, maybe this is real, maybe this is love. And that was when doubt began to creep in. His father's. A voice echoed in his mind. "Everyone loves the idea of being with a rich man, David. Do not be naive." So he did what he always did. He tested little things at first. He would downplay his wealth, talk about simpler things, observe how she reacted when he chose an ordinary restaurant instead of a 5-star dining experience. She never wavered. But this was the ultimate test. If Sophia loved him for who he was, she would not care about appearances. If she was like the others, well, he would have his answer. David barely had time to process his thoughts before Sophia took a step toward him. The guests held their breath, some exchanging smug glances, waiting for the inevitable embarrassment. But then she smiled. It was not a forced smile, not one of discomfort or humiliation. It was warm, tender. "You came," she whispered. David's throat tightened. "I did." Sophia looked at him for a long moment, then, to the absolute shock of everyone, she took his hands in hers, and then she turned to the room. The tension in the hall grew thick. People shifted uncomfortably, uncertain of what was happening. Sophia's father coughed, stepping forward. "Sophia, is everything all right?" His voice was laced with unease, his eyes flickering between her and David's unimpressive attire. Sophia exhaled, then lifted her chin. "Everything is fine, Father." Her mother, standing rigid beside him, gave a strained smile. "Then, shall we continue? But, dear, should we perhaps—" She hesitated, glancing at David's suit with barely concealed disdain. Sophia's grip on David's hands tightened. She knew exactly what was happening. She turned back to him, her eyes filled with an emotion that made his chest ache. "You wanted to see my reaction, did you not?" she whispered, just for him to hear. David tensed. She was always sharp, too sharp. He said nothing. Sophia smiled again, but this time there was something teasing in it. She leaned in just slightly, her voice softer now. "Well," she said loud, enough for the entire room to hear, "I think you look perfect." Gasps rippled through the crowd. David's heart slammed against his ribs. Sophia turned back to the guests, her expression unreadable. "A wedding is about love, is it not? Not about expensive suits or material things." Some guests exchanged nervous glances. Others muttered amongst themselves. David searched her eyes, waiting. Was she being genuine, or was she saying this because she felt trapped? And then she did something that no one expected. She let go of his hands, reached up, and pulled off her veil. The entire hall fell into stunned silence. David stared, completely thrown. What was she doing? Her father took a step forward. "Sophia, what are you—" She cut him off with a calm voice. "If David's appearance is enough to make you all doubt him, then maybe you never truly believed in us to begin with." David felt the air in his lungs still, and then Sophia turned to him, her eyes steady, unwavering. She smiled. "Now," she said, her voice filled with a quiet challenge, "shall we get married?" David could not move, because for the first time in his life he realized maybe he had been the one who needed to be tested all along, but he had no idea what would happen next. David felt as if time had slowed, the weight of Sophia's words still hanging thick in the air. The shocked silence in the grand wedding hall stretched, tension simmering beneath the surface. Faces of disapproval, confusion, and hidden amusement surrounded them. His eyes darted to Sophia's parents. Her father's jaw tightened, his gaze burning into David with barely concealed hostility. Her mother's lips were pursed into a thin line, her grip on her pearl necklace tightening. David knew that look. It was the look of a woman who felt betrayed, not by her daughter, but by the fact that their perfectly crafted image was now at risk. Then the first whisper came. "She is really going to marry him. Like this." Someone chuckled under their breath. "What a joke. This cannot be real." David's fingers twitched at his side. This was exactly what he had expected, but what he had not expected was the steel in Sophia's expression as she lifted her chin and turned toward her parents. "Father," she said, her voice deceptively calm, "if you have something to say, say it." Her father let out a slow breath through his nose. "Sophia, my dear, I think we all need a moment to reconsider." Reconsider. David clenched his fists. Sophia's mother took a step forward, her voice softer, but no less cutting. "Sweetheart, no one here wants to embarrass you. We just do not understand why David would show up like this." Her gaze flickered over his cheap suit, distaste evident in every syllable. David opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but before he could, Sophia let out a quiet laugh. It was not forced. It was not bitter. It was genuine. David stared. At her, Sophia turned to the guests, her smile unwavering. "I know what you are all thinking," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "You think this is some sort of joke. You think I should be humiliated, maybe even that I should." "Change my mind." No one dared to speak, but the tension in the air deepened. Sophia's mother took a slow step forward, reaching for her daughter's hand. "Darling, it is not about embarrassment. It is about making sure you are choosing the right path." David saw the way Sophia's fingers twitched, the brief flicker of doubt in her eyes. He knew this was the moment she could walk away, the moment his test could prove everything his father had warned him about. But then Sophia turned to him, and what he saw in her eyes was not doubt at all. She squeezed his hand, and suddenly it was not the whispers that mattered, not the disapproving looks. not the judgment in the room. All that mattered was her. Her father, realizing he was losing control, straightened his suit jacket and turned his sharp eyes toward David. "You planned this, did you not?" His voice was low, dangerous. David met his gaze. "Excuse me. You wanted to humiliate her, to make a spectacle of this family. I do not know what your motive is, but let me be clear, David. You are beneath my daughter." Gasps rippled through the guests. David felt the words strike something deep inside him, a coldness settling in his chest. Sophia's father was not just angry. He wanted to break him. For a brief moment, David felt small again, like he was back in his father's study as a boy, listening to the endless lectures about power and appearances. Never let them see weakness, David. People respect power. If you show them anything less, they will devour you. He had spent his whole life believing those words, but standing here, with Sophia at his side, he realized something. Power was not about wearing an expensive suit. Power was not about how much money you had. Power was in choosing to stand firm. "David, inhale deeply and let go of the fear." "No," he said, his voice steady. "I did not plan this to humiliate anyone." He took a step forward, facing Sophia's father head-on. "I came here today the way I did because I needed to know if I was marrying someone who loved me for me, not my money, not my last name, just me." Silence. David glanced at Sophia. "I know that may sound foolish to you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper now, "but I have spent my entire life questioning whether anyone actually cares about me, or if they only care about what I can give them." Sophia's grip on his hand tightened. "And now?" she asked gently. David exhaled. "And now, I think I finally have my answer." A sharp breath left her lips. Her father, however, was not done. He turned toward Sophia, his expression unreadable. "Do you understand what you are doing?" Sophia did not hesitate. "Yes. You are throwing away a life of comfort. A life without struggle. For what? A test?" His voice dropped lower. "I raised you to be smarter than this." Sophia's eyes hardened. "No, father. You raised me to care more about appearances than about people." Her mother let out a choked gasp. Sophia took another step closer to David. "But I will not live my life that way." David watched her, something deep inside him unraveling. She was choosing him, not because she had to, not because she felt pressured, but because she wanted to. Her father's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening. It was clear he was losing control of the situation, and he hated it. Finally, he straightened, his voice like steel. "If you go through with this, Sophia, you will no longer have a place in this family." A heavy silence fell over the hall. David's stomach clenched. Sophia's mother let out a quiet, desperate, "Darling, do not do this." But Sophia did not waver. Instead, she let out a slow breath. Then she looked at her parents and smiled. "I will always love you both," she said softly, "but I will not be controlled by you." Her father's face twisted in rage. "You ungrateful—" Sophia turned back to David, and in that moment it was like the world had shrunk to just the two of them. David swallowed hard. "Are you sure?" Sophia smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have never been more sure of anything." David felt something inside him crack. The walls he had spent years building. He had tested her, and she had passed. But in the end, she had tested him too, and he had finally learned what it meant to be loved. A slow smile spread across his lips. "Then," he said, his voice filled with something he had not felt in years, "let us get married." And as the whispers of disbelief, the disapproving glances, and the weight of expectation faded into nothing, David finally understood what his mother had meant all those years ago. The hardest thing in this world is knowing who truly loves you. But now he knew.